broadcast for shooters, hunters, and gun enthusiasts. This is the Firearms Radio Network. The bandwidth for this episode of Gun Guy Radio is sponsored by Patriot Patch Company. PatriotPatch.co.
Hello and welcome to episode 181 of Gun Guy Radio. This is the podcast that shines a positive light on the firearms lifestyle. I'm your host, Ryan Machad, and this is your weekly dose of positive firearms talk without the politics. This week I'm joined by Nathaniel, a writer and firearms historian for the Firearms blog, to discuss the self-loading rifle trials of the 1920s, which ultimately led to the adoption of the M1 Garand. So, as always, please consider supporting the Firearms Radio Network by shopping Amazon using our Amazon affiliate link at firearmsradio.tv/Amazon. A portion of your purchase will go towards helping the FRN create awesome pro-gun content like this show. And also, check out the Huckleberry Patch from the Patriot Patch Company. There's a link in the show notes. It's patriotpatch.co. So, Nathaniel, how you doing? Great to have you on the show.
How you doing? I'm doing pretty good.
Really excited to talk about this topic. As everybody knows, I'm a huge history buff, especially when it comes to firearms. And Nathaniel, I believe you are as well. So we should have
I would say so.
Have a pretty good discussion here. So before we get into the main topic, with any luck, shortly after this episode, I will be getting to go out and shoot some vintage Smith & Wesson revolvers. So. Got an N frame from the early 1900s, I believe 1924 in 44 Special, a couple 3220s, and a I frame in 32 Smith & Wesson Long. Have you had any experience shooting wheel guns, Nathaniel?
I haven't had very much. I'm mostly an automatic guy, but I'm trying to get into wheel guns, actually. We've got a Blackhawk coming in convertible from 45 Long Colt to 45 ACP. So
those are very fun. My buddy has one convertible between 9mm and 357, and it shoots great. So
that's pretty rad.
You should enjoy it. So that about wraps up the week in review. So we're going to head into the main topic, the self-loading rifle trials with Nathaniel from the Firearms blog.
Do you shop on Amazon? How about your spouse? Does your mom? Does your company? Why not use the Firearms Radio Network's Amazon affiliate link next time you shop Amazon? Bookmark firearmsradio.tv/Amazon or click through the Amazon link in the right-hand corner of firearmsradio.tv. Get it? Got it? Amazon it!
Everybody knows or thinks they know the story of the M1 Garand. It was the self-loading rifle. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But do they actually know that there was a pretty nice rifle, actually, the Pedersen, that also competed with it in the 1920s? Did they know that the self-loading rifle concept really wasn't something that John Garand came up with? It was something that he pretty much perfected in that time. But in terms of the concept of it, the French did something earlier, didn't they?
Yeah, the French actually started working on self-loading rifles almost immediately after adopting repeating rifles with the Lebel 1886. The first French self-loading rifle projects began in actually 1892, which is mind-blowingly early to the modern conception of self-loading rifles. And they worked on that concept very, very diligently all the way through the 1920s and 1930s. I would say at least to my knowledge, there were two nations that were really serious about getting self-loading rifles out there, the French and the Americans. And the French actually had a little bit of a lead on us. So
Now, the one that I was looking at, and I had seen a long time ago, was the Fusil Automatique Model 1917, or the RSC 1917.
Right.
And that one was chambered in 8mm Lebel, and it kind of gives it that, what do they say, the pregnant guppy look of the receiver.
It uses 5-round M-block clips, and that design actually was probably may have been an influence on the Garand. Certainly the U.S. tested that design in the 19-teens and 1920s. Now, I'm sure Garand would have had contact with it, but I don't think Garand himself would have tested it, because I think the testing occurred before Garand actually started working at Springfield Armory. But they would have had them there at Springfield Armory, and he would have been able to take a look at them. That gun, they produced, I think, about 90,000 of them in World War I. So not a small number. and that was probably one of the first significant self-loading rifles to be in service, but it was not the standard issue arm.
Now, I remember them saying that it had like a big, long operating arm on the outside of it where, dirt and gunk could maybe get in, and probably not the most reliable, but the concept of the self-loading rifle really had started to sort of take hold, especially, France was one of the larger armies of the time, right?
Right, yeah. No, they were very militarily significant.
So how did that progress, at least in the United States? What was the beginnings of Garand's work on the self-loading rifle concept, and then also Pedersen's?
Well, both the American and French governments had like major initiatives to get self-loading rifle development going. And the chief of U.S. Army Ordnance in the early 1900s, even before we had adopted the 1903 Springfield, I think there's a memo of him saying something to the effect of, like, basically our next infantry arm is going to load itself. It's going to be self-loading. And so that's when that development starts happening. And then sometime, I think it's in the 19-teens, Congress actually passes a law saying that anyone who is a designer who's working on self-loading rifles gets free, fully completed 30 caliber barrels from the government. That was an act of Congress. So we were very serious about it. We were very serious. We tested self-loading rifles from all over the world. Garand actually starts working on his self-loading rifle in the late 19-teens, towards the end of World War I. He's trying to create an automatic rifle like the Browning automatic rifle for World War I. And then I believe it was 1919, he begins working at Springfield Armory. And the focus shifts to an infantry rifle, a standard issue weapon.
Now, Pedersen had some military contact prior to this, especially in World War I. Didn't he produce what we now know as the Pedersen device? And it really wasn't something that was out there a lot. It was not widely adopted or anything like that, or really even used, if I recall. But the concept of a small self-loading rifle was there as well. Yeah.
The Pedersen device, actually, we made very large numbers of them. And it was adopted, but the war ended before we could use them. And they were very, very secret. And what that basically was is you take the 1903 and you take the bolt out of it, and then you can insert this special bolt that has a stick magazine for these small little pistol cartridges that are able to go through the barrel of the 1903 and stabilize. And that basically turns it into, it's not a submachine gun because it's not fully automatic. It's only semi-automatic, but sort of a higher rate of fire for the infantrymen. And that was a highly secret development, the U.S., and that was Pedersen's development. Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure that gave Pedersen a leg up, at least in terms of having contacts in the military circles.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that Pedersen's one of the few people who, during his own lifetime, was a rock star who was a gun designer. I mean, that he was absolutely famous.
So, did Pedersen, because I know you've had a chance to shoot the Pedersen rifle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Did Pedersen's concept come before the Garand, or did Garand's concept come before that?
Well, you get two different Garands that you're talking about here. So one of them came before Pedersen's, and one of them came after. The two different Garands that you have the gas-operated one that became what we now know as the M1 Garand. And then before that, Pedersen was working on a primer-actuated design. And he started working on that sometime in 1918, 1919. And that design, eventually, certain considerations basically shut that design down. They started changing the way the ammunition was made so it wouldn't work with the action anymore. And he stopped working on that, I think, in about 1925 or 26. And Pedersen actually approached Ordnance with his concept, his vision for self-loading rifle. The difficulty of that era in producing self-loading rifles, the whole concern was, well, we know we can produce self-loading rifles, but we don't think we can produce ones that meet all of the requirements and come in under the 9.5-pound weight limit. So Pedersen basically approaches Ordnance and says that I can solve this problem for you. I will design for you a rifle that uses neither gas operation nor recoil operation, both systems that had, at the time, some technical difficulties that made them a little bit problematic for self-loading rifles. Not only that, it'll be chambered for a 27 caliber cartridge that'll be smaller and lighter than the 30-06, and most importantly, will allow the design of the gun to come under the weight limit, because that's the primary factor in the size and weight of a gun is the size of cartridge that it fires.
So he was kind of before his time in terms of coming up with an intermediate cartridge of sorts, because, I mean, the 30-06 is a massive cartridge.
Well, he was definitely ahead of his time in terms of coming up with the action that he used, which was a delayed blowback type. And I think that the 276 Pedersen was a bit bigger than people think it is. It's not quite as powerful as 308, but it's not that far off either. So it's not like a 6.8 SPC. It's quite a bit bigger than that.
Okay. And so where was Garand on this as well? Because, I mean, you had Pedersen, who already sort of had inroads in the military circles in terms of getting his designs and his thoughts out to people who mattered. How did Garand start factoring into this?
Right, so Garand was already working for Springfield Armory by this point. So this was in 1923 is when Pedersen does his pitch. And Ordnance basically says, that sounds like a great idea. We are going to and he negotiates with Ordnance, Pedersen does, to be put in Springfield, to be an engineer at Springfield Armory. He's going to get triple the pay of an engineer because Pedersen is so sure that he will do this. He's so sure that he can solve this problem and no one else can, that he's negotiated these extremely favorable terms for himself. So he gets an absolutely insane pension. He gets put up in a penthouse suite. And he negotiates for $1 royalties for every rifle that eventually gets made, which is a pretty substantial sum at that point in time. Garand is working as an engineer for a normal amount of pay at Springfield Armory, and he is working on his primer actuated design. By 1925, Pedersen's design is complete, and at this point, the real mover and shaker in this is Pedersen. He's the one who's moving all of this along. He's the one who's spurring people into competition because his design is extremely good. And in 1925, he produces the first Pedersen rifle, and it's really not that different from the Pedersens that would eventually be produced that were more perfected versions. So in a lot of ways, he did get it right the first time. And Garand works on his primer actuated design for a little while after that, and then he starts changing because of a change in the way that they made 30-06 ammunition. They started staking the primers, and the primer actuated design requires the primer to move. So if the primer's staked, then you can't do that. And he starts working on a gas operated design, which isn't all that mechanically different from the RSC 1917. But uses a rotary bolt. In a lot of ways, it's like a gas-operated bolt-action rifle, and
right.
That's the T1 Garand, and you would recognize that as a Garand. If you saw a T1 in front of you, you'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's a Garand." Kind of a weird-looking one. It's got like a sheet metal handguard. Looks like somebody's kind of tacticaled it up. But that design is completed in late 1927, and then soon after that, you have some trials of self-loading rifles in 1929. That are really important.
And those are going in with a 276 from then on?
Right. So in 1928, Ordnance basically says, we're totally sold on this 276 idea. The Pedersen has performed so well. I believe by this point, the Pedersen has actually been recommended for adoption. So the fact that Pedersen got that far that early is absolutely amazing. He absolutely deserves a lot of credit for that design. It really is slick. And it's totally different from a lot of the other self-loading rifles that were around at the time. It feels finished.
Right.
They declare in 1928, Ordnance does, that all feature submissions should be in the 276 caliber. They'll accept submissions that aren't, but that's their preference, is for 276 caliber. And they release the specifications for that. And that's the first time you start seeing people who aren't Pedersen design rifles in 276.
But then they did something, if I recall correctly. They did something that sort of started changing their mind on that cartridge. Yeah.
So this is about the time that the 276 Garand comes around. The T1 was in 30 caliber, was in 30-06, and the T1 it was almost within the weight limit. And it's in the 30 caliber cartridge, which they previously thought was impossible. They previously thought that you could not design something that was within the weight limit that was in 30 caliber. But they test a rifle in 1929 that really does change the way they look at this problem. And that rifle is a Czech rifle called the ZH-29 by a designer called Hollick. And The ZH-29 weighs under 9 pounds, and the one that they tested was in .276, but that rifle was also available in 7.9 millimeter German, what we would think of as 8 millimeter Mauser today.
Which is not an insubstantial cartridge.
No, that's almost as big as 30-06, and
right.
that really starts changing Ordnance's mind. Now, I don't think that at that point they were going to drop the Pedersen entirely, but that sort of puts it into their head that actually this might be doable. And that was sort of the big linchpin holding Pedersen's case together.
Now, going from there, did Pedersen have any idea that they had discovered, that you could make a gun in this cartridge, or was he still kind of unaware of that fact?
I doubt he got into their minds that much. I doubt he realized how significant that was.
So what ultimately caused them to say, you know what, we're gonna ditch this Pedersen dude for right now and kind of go with this rifle from this essentially unknown to them designer, Garand?
Oh, Garand was definitely not well known.
Right.
Pedersen. It sort of happened gradually, and it happened in stages. So Garand's .276 caliber rifle, the T3, ended up performing pretty well, and almost as good as the Pedersen. And in trials, the two rifles really were neck and neck at this point. So this is where Pedersen first gets his first real competition, because everything else is not even remotely comparable to a Pedersen in terms of like reliability and handling and any of these other important characteristics. They've all got some kind of problem. The early self-loaders are this ungainly lot, and the .276 Garand is really one of the first guns that gives the Pedersen a serious run for its money. So the fact that they have an alternative design kind of throws a little bit of doubt on Pedersen, because remember, he negotiated some really favorable terms for himself that would have been downright dumb if he had thought he was going to have any competition, which he didn't. He thought he was going to totally knock it out of the park.
Right.
And so the fact that there was an alternative sort of starts to... That's one of the major reasons that Pedersen's design wasn't adopted. And then to add kind of insult to injury on top of this, Pedersen, unaware that sort of the winds are changing, in 1930 travels to England because he's so sure that he's going to get his rifle adopted that he wants to set up production with the Vickers Company in England. And England desperately wants a common rifle and cartridge with the United States, and the Pedersen rifle and the .276 caliber seem like just the gun and cartridge to adopt. And while he's away, they perform trials between the Garand and the Pedersen, and the Pedersen performs well, but that absence of Pedersen not being there for the trials kind of, turns the ordnance off to Pedersen's idea, with the delayed blowback rifle. And I think ordnance saw the advantages of the .276. I don't think it would be fair to say that they didn't think the .276 was a good idea, but the considerations of having two calibers in service were weighed very heavily on their minds. And so that was where you start seeing the next rifle is going to be in .30 caliber coming from.
Well, and also, I mean, like you said, Garand was a government employee, and he didn't have the royalty deal, like you said, the favorable conditions. I mean,
right? Yeah, they had a massive incentive by that point, as if Garand's rifle could be found suitable for production, they had a massive incentive to choose it over Pedersen's.
Right. So, when did the military actually say, you know what, we're going to not use this? What year was that? Was it 32?
Right. So in 32, General MacArthur, who gets a really bad rap for this decision, by the way, General MacArthur hands down the decision informed by Ordnance. This was a decision recommended by Ordnance officials to drop development of the .276 Pedersen and continue development only with the .30-06 caliber. What they were afraid of was that they didn't think that the .276 Pedersen could meet their requirements for machine guns, and they thought it was a fine caliber for rifles, but they didn't want to be using two calibers in service at the same time.
Right, you need that commonality.
That's what they were going for with that. So,
now there's one other thing, and we'll kind of get into this when we talk about your actual hands-on experience with the Pedersen, but also the .276, at least in the Pedersen rifle, wasn't it a waxed cartridge?
Yeah, so they used a sort of a lost wax process on the cartridges. The wax is very dry. It's not it's not this sort of wet wax. You wouldn't hold it in your hands and like the wax is coming off. It feels very dry. I have one in the rounds right here with me, actually. And it actually acts as a preservative. The cartridges, if you look at 276 ammunition, and the stuff is 85 years old, if you look at the stuff that still exists, it's in really great condition. Aside from like season cracking on the necks, it looks brand new. And the reason for that is it's preserved in this wax, and that wax, it doesn't pick up dirt, it doesn't pick up dust, it's not wet. It's actually a really great idea. And unlike a G3, which uses, it's also delayed blowback, but it uses fluting. It uses cuts in the chamber to allow gas to come around and sort of float the case in the chamber so it can extract. Instead of that, the Pedersen was using this wax, and when the cartridge fires, that wax actually melts and floats the case in the chamber in a very similar manner. What we found when we shot the Pedersen is that you cannot pick up ammo directly after it's been shot because that wax is still liquid and it's really hot. And so you have to sort of let it sit on the ground. And the cartridges, well, after they've been shot, end up looking really dirty, like someone has like taken like old motor oil and rubbed it all over them for some reason. That's
curious. And then also one of the advantages, I guess, you said here in your notes, Garand was a tool maker.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so his experience helped with the development of the rifle as well?
That soon becomes really relevant. After Garand's rifle is adopted officially in 1933, this is continuing development of the T1. The T3 has been terminated, and the 30-06 caliber T1 is becoming the M1. This would be in the Great Depression, and Springfield Armory has actually had to lay off a bunch of its workers, and so most of their master tool makers have actually left. Garand is one of the only tool makers that they have left in Springfield Armory. He used to work, before he worked at Springfield Armory, he worked at Brown & Sharp making tools. And the fact that the Garand's real genius is the fact that he not only designed the tools to make the M1, he designed some of the tools to make the tools to make the M1. So he had the whole system in place. He figured everything out. That rifle was his design in a way that few rifles are. He was singularly responsible for the Garand in a way that few designers are singularly responsible for their product.
Right. A lot of other people piggyback off of other designs, but now, he really came up with that. And it's interesting to note, everybody thinks, and I don't want people to think that we're, ragging on the Pedersen or anything like that unfairly, but, maybe because of, we've always known the Garand, so that's the one we think is the best. That's not the case. There was just the way the circumstances played out and, ultimately the difference between the cartridges and stuff like that. That was a major disadvantage in Garand's favor.
Yeah. Once Pedersen was just a little bit too sure. He was a little bit too sure that he would win. And if you look at the Pedersen rifle, you can see why. It is a work of absolutely brilliant genius. And Pedersen just didn't expect that there would be two geniuses in the room. He did not. That was his big hubris, is that he didn't expect to have competition. And that may have actually been reasonable, but turned out to be wrong.
Now, in your opinion, do you think that there would have been a push to go to a smaller intermediate cartridge if we had adopted, let's say we adopted the Garand in 276 Pedersen? Do you think that later on down the road, like when, the 5.56 came around, that there would have been a push to adopt that, or the 308, or would we have just stuck with that?
That's sort of an interesting question. I think that in many cases the 276 would have basically taken the place of the 7.62x51 NATO. That all of this is getting like really speculative, but I don't think that the existence of a 276 service caliber would have prevented the development of the 5.56.
Right.
I think that 5.56 would have still come around. All that research was kind of independent, and 276 is close enough in size to the 7.62 NATO, especially the caliber they were going to adopt. The 276 ammo that's running around is slightly smaller in diameter than 30-06. But that's not the final cartridge. That's not the cartridge they were actually going to adopt. The cartridge they were going to adopt was called the T2. And the T2 used the same case base as 30-06. They expanded the powder capacity, so it's almost a 7mm 08 is almost the size that we're talking about.
Okay.
And so they expanded the powder capacity to allow for different types of powders to be loaded into it. They were worried about production flexibility because they have all these commercial manufacturers that they have making military ammunition for them. And so the T2 really would have been, it would have been very, very, very close in size to the 7.62 NATO. And actually, the people who were developing the 7.62 NATO thought of the 7.62 NATO as the perfected 276 caliber. So, which is kind of interesting. You don't think about it that way anymore, but that was the way they thought of it. They thought that they were improving it by increasing the caliber, which is sort of true in some ways.
It is always fun to speculate, even though we probably don't have anything to base it on. But it is kind of, those what-ifs of history. What if this had turned out differently would be interesting. Now, you are one of a very few people who have fired a Pedersen, I believe it was the Vickers one, the PB.
It was a PB, yeah.
And there's a video on Forgotten Weapons and on the Firearms blog. I think it was TFB TV that you guys did it on.
Yep.
And showing this being shot. There, I will link to that in the show notes. It is a fantastic video with probably the only high-speed footage of a Pedersen rifle being fired.
I think we have the only footage of a Pedersen being fired.
Oh, really? Even better.
Yeah. So
how, in your opinion, because I know there were so many questions. You and I were talking about how people were complaining that, the toggle comes up in your face like a Luger and it's distracting. And it's like, you haven't really ever fired a Luger, have you? Because it's pretty fast.
It happens really quickly. And it happens even quicker on the Pedersen because the Pedersen's not recoil operated. It's delayed blowback. So it is pulling that cartridge out of the chamber basically as quickly as it can, and you don't notice it at all. I had nobody noticed it even to the smallest degree.
No,
that was a total non-issue.
What were some of your impressions of the rifle? Because I'm sure you fired a Garand before.
Oh yeah. The Pedersen was fantastic. You were talking earlier about how we're kind of getting down on Pedersen, and the historical treatment of it kind of does reflect that, but the Pedersen is an absolute work of genius. It is a totally fantastic rifle. If you consider the fact that design came out in 1925 and you compare it to other rifles from the 1920s that were trying to win self-loading rifle contracts, it is mind-blowingly better. It is total leaps ahead. You compare it to something like the Thompson auto rifle, which was also sort of delayed blowback, except that they weren't substantially delaying it. So if you imagine like a rifle that's a big blowback 30-06, like that's barely containing the cartridges, and the cartridges are being ejected and like embedding themselves in pine boards and things, and it's absolutely insane, right? And I've seen a lot of these early self-loading rifles, and the Pedersen is absolutely a step ahead. And it's really obvious to me why it's the first one that got recommended for adoption.
Now, it uses a similar M-block clip system as the Garand, right?
Yes. That was the product of, basically they were worried about magazines being too heavy and too expensive. And so it wasn't, you hear a lot about how like they didn't like detachable box magazines. I've never gotten that impression. I've gotten the impression that they always thought that in terms of loading, detachable box magazines were absolutely the best way to go, but they thought they were too heavy, and they thought they were too expensive. So the PB, its clip is actually not reversible like a Garand's, but they did make versions of the Pedersen that had reversible clips.
Now, how hard was it to find those clips? I imagine they're not very plentiful like the Garand's. I'm sure you can get the Garand ones for, $1, if that.
Yeah, the Pedersen clips were absolutely impossible to find. We were very lucky to have gotten it. The whole endeavor obviously would have come crashing down around our ears if we hadn't gotten it, but that was very lucky.
Now,
I'm not going to ask Alex how much he paid for it.
Now, in terms of firing, like the recoil impulse of the 276, because I mean, honestly, there really aren't any other 276 firearms out there.
There's very little out there that's in the same that's in the same glass. Yeah.
How's the recoil impulse? Does it ping? I'm sure people want to know that. And
it does ping.
It's a different ping.
It's a different ping. It sounds different. We have some recordings of it in the video. It sounds a little bit different in person than it does on the video, but it's tinier. I don't know. It sounds higher. The recoil really was pretty mild. I wouldn't call it. It's not like the same as like a 223. It more
30-30-ish.
Yeah, if you had a self-loading 30-30.
I kind of want one now.
It reminded me a lot of like if you've ever shot an AR-15 in like 30 AR, 30 Remington AR, Yeah, it was that kind of recoil impulse. Only it felt really different because the action on the Pedersen's really different, but like that kind of magnitude.
Now, you said the action is pretty fast, and then it locks open, so it's a toggle lock, like a knee joint,
right,
and locks open on the last shot, just like a Luger would.
Right.
Have any concerns about, like, maybe if they had actually started running them in dirt and dust and stuff of fouling? Because I know Ian had done a few videos with the M1A that caused a lot of consternation among people, where dirt and dust was just filling up the op rod channel and not allowing it to fully shut. Any concerns like that with the Pedersen?
Honestly, there's a really well-kept secret that the Garand really doesn't like dust. It doesn't like dirt. This is really well proven.
Really well-ignored secret.
It's a really well-ignored secret, yeah. You look at... I have actually seen tests all the way from 2015 with the one that Ian did with the M1A to all the way back to the 1930s, where Garand and Garand derivatives like the M1A exhibit exactly the same problems in dust. So... the Garand's not particularly dust resistant. It's not particularly mud resistant. Would the Pedersen have been better or worse? I honestly couldn't tell you. My suspicion would be that it would be better, certainly up until the action opens, and then I'm not sure.
So I know Ian did one with the Mass 4956, I think.
Right.
And he said it was great until the action opened, and it's one of the advantages of it is it has this big, huge open action, but it's also sort of a disadvantage. Yeah,
that's where I'm coming from with that, definitely, is the when they're closed, the Mass and the Pedersen sort of have the same kind of external contour. They have the same kind of ceiling. They're not similar in any other respect, but they're like how the action closes up is very similar. And then once it's open, I don't know. I think it would work pretty well. It's a delayed blowback gun. Even if something got in there, it probably would just blow it open.
And this one last final question before we wrap it up here. Let's play a little what if history again at the end.
Okay.
Here. If let's say Garand never submitted a design or it failed, and the Pedersen got adopted by the United States Armed Forces.
A very, very narrow thing, by the way. That could have happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you think our small arms in terms of a rifle progression would have gone?
The first thing they would have figured out is that toggle coming up really sucks if you want to mount a scope. And they would have either mounted scopes forward of the toggle, which would have worked, or they would have figured out how to do something in maybe a Pedersen 2.0. They would have figured out how to do maybe like a side toggle or something. But in the 1940s and 50s, it became, particularly with the German developments on the G43, it became pretty obvious that what you wanted was to be able to mount scopes to all your rifles, and the Pedersen is not the greatest gun in the world to do that unless you're willing to accept a forward-mounted scope. So I think that would be the number one thing that stands out to me.
I always thought that perhaps if they had adopted it, they may not have hung on to that concept for as long, because it would seem to me that the Pedersen, with the developments elsewhere, like you said, the G43 and stuff, it would seem to me that it would have felt more quickly outdated.
Why do you think that?
Well, the toggle, I don't know, maybe it's just my impression of the toggle lock design. Like you said, where it's going up, it's hitting like scope thing, and we would see the G43.
For the record, the Garand has problems with the scope too.
Right, exactly. You had that offset scope on the M1D.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Maybe it's just my like we said. We may be a little bit biased, or at least me, in terms of that, because we've always thought of the Garand is because it was the one we had.
I think we think of the Garand as being a later design than it actually is. We think of the Garand as being like a 40s and 50s and maybe 60s if you include the M14 kind of gun, right?
Right.
It's not. It's from the exact same era as the Pedersen. And so if the Pedersen had been adopted, maybe we would think of the Pedersen as a 40s and 50s and maybe even 60s gun.
Maybe Springfield Armory, the company, would be making the Pedersen 1A.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One other thing that I think might have changed is I think that the Americans might have warmed up more to delayed blowback in general. The Americans have never really liked delayed blowback. And maybe, especially if they were already producing ammunition that had the lubricated wax coating on it,
right?
Maybe they would have been like, you know what, delayed blowback, that makes more sense. We're more hot on that because the Pedersen already exists, so that's how the Pedersen worked.
Well, I didn't think you had it in you.
I'm your Huckleberry. Why, Johnny Ringo, you look like somebody just walked over your grave.
Fight's not with you, Holiday.
I beg to differ, sir. We started a game we never got to finish. Play for blood, remember?
I was just fooling about.
I wasn't. Say when. Show Johnny Ringo who's boss with Patriot Patch Company's Huckleberry Patch, a must-have for any range bag. Pre-order yours today at patriotpatch.co.
So, Nathaniel, I just want to thank you so much for coming on. I just really, really enjoyed this discussion, and this was just really a primer on this. This was not. I mean, we went pretty in depth, but you have articles over on TFB and linked over on your own website. So, where can people find you and kind of follow this series you're doing?
The best place to find me is on my author profile at TFB. So if you go to TFB and you search for Nathaniel F., that's me. The other place I sort of release articles from time to time on my personal blog, which is called 196,800 revolutions per minute.blogspot.com. I didn't realize that I would be on radio shows when I made that name. But yeah, those are the two best places to follow me and follow my content. I'm currently working on a series called The Light Rifle, which is tracking the development of basically 7.62 NATO rifles, like the M14, the G3, that sort of thing, tracking their history. How did that concept come about? How did we get to the point where we have select fire rifles in this big 30 caliber that kind of like is not really a great idea? Like, how did we get there? And so that's I've got 2 parts of it out and a 1.5, which is where I just sort of an introduction that I should have written. And then part 3 should be coming out this month of August, and part 4 should follow pretty close behind.
Excellent. So there will be links to those in the show notes, so make sure you guys really check those out. It'll be gunguyradio.com/181. So again, Nathaniel, thank you so much for coming on. I really think people will appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Gun Guy Radio says thank you and proudly displays artwork and graphics designed by Ryan Cross of Hunter of Design. hunterofdesign.com.
Well, I hope you're enjoying Gun Guy Radio, and if you are, please consider going over to patreon.com/FRN. What is Patreon, you might ask? Well, Patreon is a simple way for you to crowdfund every episode of Gun Guy Radio. If you're enjoying the show, you can head over to patreon.com/FRN and pledge $1 an episode or $5 an episode to help support pro-gun radio like this. So that about wraps up this episode of Gun Guy Radio. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes so that you never miss a show, and please leave us a review there as well, gunguyradio.com/iTunes. Please consider joining the NRA and the Second Amendment Foundation. There are links there in the show notes. And don't forget to check out the other shows on the Firearms Radio Network. Also, be sure to check out the Patriot Patch Company, started by FRN's own Jake Challand and Ryan Cross. Patriot Patch Company offers high-quality 3D PVC vinyl patches with Velcro backing that is sure to satisfy any taste. Their new I'm Your Huckleberry patch is available for pre-order and is a personal favorite. Patriot Patch Company is also running a pre-order right now on the Firearms Radio Network t-shirts, which are really high quality. I can't wait to get mine. And the Patriotic Flag Patch 4-pack. Be sure to check them out at www.patriotpatch.co. Gun Guy Gear helps make this show possible. Check out the great Kydex magazine pouches, paracord survival bracelets, and everyday carry gear, including cell phone cases and the Tobacco Lovers line for cigars. Head on over to gunguygear.com and check it out. This is Ryan Machad, and I'll see you next week.
This has been a production of the Firearms Radio Network. You can find more information at firearmsradio.tv. Freedom. How does one maintain freedom? That's a question our founding fathers pondered over 200 years ago. They believed the solution was in our Constitution and its amendments. We exercise the freedom of speech every day here at FRN, along with the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Preserving freedom. We believe the Second Amendment could possibly be that one amendment that protects all the rest. Help us to preserve America as a shining light on the hill. We do our part by providing entertainment and information that supports the Second Amendment every day. Preserving freedom. What do you believe? Get involved. Show your support at patreon.com/FRN.